Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Transportation Asset Management Webinar Series, Part 2, FTA and TCRP Research Results and Initiative Conference Call. I would now like to turn the call over to your host, Ms. Judy Kova from the National Transit Institute.
The presenters for today's webinar are Lauren Isaac and Dr. David Rose from Parsons Brinckerhoff and Bill Robert from Spy Pond Partners. Ms. Lauren Isaac leads Parsons Brinckerhoff's Transit Effectiveness and Management Service area. In this capacity, she assists transit agencies across the U.S. to improve their asset management, capital planning, and decision-making processes. A graduate of American Public Transportation Association's leadership program, Ms. Isaac has experience managing research and analysis assignments for a diverse range of transit providers. Whether it is assisting agencies with sweeping operational changes or developing project prioritization tools and evaluation metrics for decision-making, she has helped agencies to evaluate their capital planning and programming efforts as it relates to their own goals and industry standards. Dr. David Rose directs the Management and Strategy business line for Parsons Brinckerhoff. In this capacity, he is assisting transportation agencies to become highly performing customer-centric agencies, a key element of which addresses asset management. He has led successful organizational transformation initiatives, resulting in performance improvements and cost savings. At the enterprise level, he has helped design and implement performance management. Dr. Rose has a track record of success improving transportation agency management practices across capital planning, maintenance, and operations, assisting numerous transportation agencies with performance-based planning and programming, maintenance and preservation management, project delivery, process improvement, and strengthening financial management practices. And now I will turn the call over to Lauren and David.
Thanks, Judy. I'm David Rose. I'm joining you today from New York. What Lauren and I are excited to share with you today is the work in progress that we have been working on for 7 or 8 months now. And the purpose of this work is to provide a resource which will be of value to all of you on the call and your colleagues across the country. The purpose of it is to do a couple of things. Firstly, to increase the awareness within the industry of asset management and truly the business benefits to our agencies from becoming mature as practitioners of asset management. So it's firstly to increase the awareness, and then secondly to provide tools, pointers, and guidance on how to increase the maturity of the practice. And really the intent behind this is to drill down and to provide a resource document and information that will be useful and that will be used. So what we have done with this work is to develop what we're expecting and hoping that you'll see will become a very transit-specific application of what are generally regarded as industry standards of practice for asset management. So those of you who have followed some of this, you'll have seen reference to PAS 55, and there are other international sources of information such as the International Infrastructure Asset Management Manual, and there are some other sources as well which have a lot of detail on process. They're very good. We've used those as a starting point, and really aiming this to drill down and be something that you can use. We've really truly got a lot to share with you.
Okay, well, on that note, I will get started by talking about what David and I are going to cover in the next 30 to 35 minutes. David gave a little bit of an overview, but I'm going to go in a little bit more about the project that we were hired by the FTA to complete. David will give some idea about how transit asset management fits within the broader transit agency culture and operations. He'll also give an overview of the best practice framework that we've laid out in this manual. And then I'm going to talk about a draft asset class hierarchy that agencies can use as a starting point for developing an asset inventory. And then I will also talk about what kinds of information technology functional requirements are required to support asset management. One thing that we are incorporating throughout the asset management manual is peer practices. So we wanted to give a little bit of a flavor of some of the really great peer examples that are happening both here in the U.S. and internationally. On that note, I'll go into a little bit more detail about what this asset management manual is intended to do. As David said, we're looking to increase the awareness in the industry, so we'll be introducing some key asset management concepts. It will lay out a definition of what is best practice and how does that relate to the business processes that a transit agency is already doing and can be doing and can improve. It will provide guidance for how an agency can assess how it's currently doing with asset management and then what the agency can do to increase its maturity. And we're going to talk more about asset management maturity later in this presentation. And then finally, we're including tools and a good amount of case studies and peer examples that can help transit agencies really understand how this all relates to their day-to-day business. Because we understand a lot of this might seem a little philosophical, but it's truly practices that agencies are already doing. What we've found is that there's no one transit agency that's doing everything perfectly, but there are a lot of really great examples around the country and the world that can be learned from. The only other thing I'll add is that the intended audience for this manual is, what we're expecting is that it will range for really to anyone that touches asset management, any stakeholders, and that can range from board members to the general manager of an agency to managers to line staff. And the idea is that all of these people have their role in asset management, and at the beginning of the manual we help the different readers navigate to sections that are most meaningful to them. Because bottom line is, the idea is that everyone should understand what asset management is and then how their role can support and fit into that broader asset management strategy. As David mentioned, we've been working on this for many months, almost a year now. We've spent a lot of our time researching other guidance documents that are used around the world. As David said, PAS 55 and IIMM. These are just a couple of examples of other asset management guides. But in addition to that, we've been really trying to zero in on what's most meaningful to U.S. transit agencies, since that is our target audience. So we've done a lot of research just with what other agencies are doing around the country. Then we developed a best practice model. We're really at the tail end of developing an implementation framework, and we're really in the middle of finalizing the manual and going through a review process. You'll see that there's this orange arrow across the bottom, partner agency collaboration. We really thought the definition of success for this manual is going to be that transit agencies around the country find the manual to be digestible and understandable and relatable to your day-to-day practices. We were really happy to have 3 agencies agree to partner with us, and we have collaborated with them throughout the process. And these partner agencies include LA Metro, Los Angeles Metro, New York MTA, and UTA in Salt Lake City. So in addition, we've also taken every opportunity we can to share presentations and just all of the pieces of this document with people in the industry, and we've been grateful for that. I wanted to start by just giving some context for why asset management is so important and why it's especially important right now. Back in 2010, the FTA published a report called the National State of Good Repair Assessment, and this is just one graphic of many, but this one really highlights the growing need for improved asset management practices. The FTA very often throws out the number $77.7 billion backlog right now for transit assets, and that's including both bus and rail transit assets. The FTA's approach was to use the TERM model, which gives a condition rating to all assets of 1 to 5, and then any assets that are rated below 2.5 are deemed to be not in a state of good repair. This graphic shows the value of the assets that are in each of those condition values, and so $77.7 billion is the number that we're faced with right now, and obviously it's really been growing. Other reasons for focusing on asset management, as all of you know, there's been a pretty significant focus on expansion, and the industry as a whole is realizing that we need to shift our focus to managing our existing assets. Similarly, a lot of decisions are made with a pretty short-term focus. We fix what's broken right now, and we don't necessarily think about the long-term implications and the full life cycle of assets. And then finally, with funding shortages and the uncertainty around federal funding and even state and local funding, it's led to a lot of deferred maintenance. And as we know, that might work in the short term, but it has pretty significant implications in the longer term.
And we provide in the manual some of that context and some more detail on what's generally known about the current condition of our transit assets by broad grouping and characterization of assets. And that really, I think, makes the case very clearly as to why we need to get better. In the manual, as a starting point, we've arrived at a definition for asset management. It's written here, and I'm going to read it and then really get to the two key concepts which this really captures. And we've defined it in the manual as that transit asset management's a strategic, and we'll talk some about what we mean by strategic, and a systematic process. And we provide, in the manual, we identify these processes, which in a very consistent way we see that you could all implement, and many of you will have pieces of them. And it's through which the organization procures, installs, operates, maintains, rehabilitates, replaces transit assets. So that's across the whole life cycle to manage performance, risks, and costs, again, over the life cycle, so that we're providing cost-effective, reliable, and safe service to current and future customers. That captures the the kind of bottom line of what asset management is. And there are two key concepts which we expound on, and we provide guidance and examples of how to really operationalize. The first one is that at the end of the day, what we're really doing with asset management is we're managing across the life of the asset. It's bringing that perspective of the whole life cycle into asset management. And as you know, the nature of that life cycle will be different for different asset classes, as we've been calling them, whether it's a guideway for rail, or it could be a guideway, a road that's dedicated for transit. Some transit agencies actually have to own and are responsible for life cycle management of that actual roadway that the transit vehicle goes over. Others aren't, but it's the application across that life cycle. And the second and related concept is that, and that's what this exhibit illustrates, is that at the end of the day, when we're doing asset management, we're making management decisions that really balance risk with cost and to provide a certain level of performance. And we do that in managing the entire scope of our transit operations, or we may do it on very specific decisions that we make about the work that we do on a specific asset. And those two concepts are very much central and key to asset management and the information that we provide in the manual. The other theme within this is that asset management really is and should be embedded within how we manage our business, manage the business of the agency. And that at one level, we think that it really is an enterprise process. And by an enterprise process, what we really mean is that it's agency-wide. Asset management isn't something that is owned by a specific part of the agency, but it should be embedded across the entire business of the agency at the same level with which you would look at your overall performance management, your risk management, the overall things that relate to your strategic planning and management. Put another way, if the business of a transit agency is to have safe, reliable, cost-effective service that is customer-driven, asset management is key to that. And if we are performing as a very mature asset management organization, we get to those outcomes in a more cost-effective, more successful way. Now, all that being said, as you know, what we're talking about with asset management is difficult to do at two levels. One, if we're managing across all those functions that we've included in the definition of asset management across the life cycle, from procurement through to actually even backing up into capital planning and budgeting and into procurement and then on through the life of the assets. We're really managing across many different functional areas, which is a very difficult thing for us to do. Historically, many of our agencies are not set up. The whole history and organizational structure of the agency is not based upon that. So we're managing differently. We're managing across the function, and in so doing, we're also having to manage across some of our other challenges, which are color of money, and not just color of money between federal and non-federal funding and between capital and maintenance. Oftentimes, it's been historically color of money between different types of transit service within a transit agency or between different parts of the region that you serve. So we're managing across all of that, and then when you add in the other complexity that we've got the time dimension with different stakeholders with very different time horizons, it becomes quite complex. The message within the guidance is that to address that, we really need to be embedding asset management into how we manage and run the agency, and that's why the theme of the graphic in front of you here is that it really needs to be embedded within the strategic management. Now, we also recognize that we want to be real specific about the work that we do at all levels. The guide lays out what we've called an asset management framework, and this is how you can look at your business, your organization. The exhibit here provides a way to start to organize our thinking, and it's suitably general that it can apply to everybody, but it's suitably specific to provide a way to start to put your arms around that complexity and move to a better place with asset management. Two things I want to draw your attention to in this exhibit here. One's the enterprise level, and again, that's terminology which really refers to the whole organization and agency, and there's management activity that we do which is about the policy and strategy of the agency and how we put forward what we want to be held accountable for with customers and with the board, and that asset management is a part of that. And then there's another agency-wide process which asset management again is a part of or embedded in, and that is the planning and management decision-making that takes place across assets or across different goal areas. It could be making decisions between expansion and the level of service or the level to which we maintain and preserve existing service. But we have enterprise level activities, and then when you drill down within the organization, we have asset classes, and this is a way we have organized a high level for an asset class hierarchy. And I would also mention that, again, we're sharing with you work in progress. We've actually made a few changes that change this as part of our collaboration with the industry. But the point is that in each of your agencies, there will be managers and employees with responsibility for different asset classes, and you may manage at these levels. And at that level is where asset management also belongs. So this provides a framework for looking at that and starting to think about how you're organized and what if you like the terminology, what the architecture is for asset management. The way in which we have then within the guide organized and approached this is by identifying best practice processes, but also providing a general model for what you would expect to have in place for a mature asset management organization and what the processes would be. This exhibit refers to those processes, and they're in three blocks. And I want to just take a little bit of time to orient you to them going from left to right, because I think it's important. A key to be successful with being a better asset management organization is to embed the practice of asset management within your process. And there may well be a need for some new processes, but the strategy is to embed it within the processes. So on the left, we've identified three sets of agency-wide or enterprise processes that you would have in place for addressing asset management and that you would see in a mature organization. They are policy, and in the manual we provide guidance on this, but policy, as you might expect, is incorporating into how you set forth policy for the agency, policy for asset management. And that policy could be that you've set policy goals to become a asset management organization. It could be that they relate very specifically to measurement or accountability for reliability, or for delivering the level of service as measured by the schedule at a certain target. Different ways in which you could set that, but the point that we talk about is that how this policy is set is it should be embedded in how you set other policy. And similarly for strategy, it should be incorporated into the strategic management and planning processes that you have, and that asset management should be a part of that strategy. And then the other policy element at this level is that it should be incorporated into your business planning, and that really is the nearer term commitment of resources and organizational commitment to either improve asset management practice or to have other business planning if that's the case. But each of those processes are identified and guidance on them provided, as well as many examples of what these actually look like and what some of the agencies, maybe some of you who are on the call, have provided as a good example, so that there's an illustration there. The other core part of the processes are almost, if you like, the nuts and bolts of life cycle management. And we've laid out and identified that for every class of assets, there's a core set of activities or processes that should be in place if you're performing at a high level for asset management. Very simply, they are that we have an inventory, we know what we have, that we maintain that inventory, that we have levels of performance or levels of service set for those assets that relate back to either their reliability, their ability to meet your level of service or performance goals. In addition to that, we have a process for assessing condition and monitoring it, and the extent to which we also can then have a capability to then determine or predict or model the future performance based upon different activities that we do to manage across the life cycle. And then as part of this, for every asset class, there should be a life cycle management plan. And all those elements of the processes that I mentioned, they all are taking place to one degree or another right now for some assets or for all of the assets, and with differing levels of success. And the manual provides guidance, and Lauren later will give you a little bit more example of what this looks like in practice. But we go quite deep here because we think this provides a real specificity and things that you can start to build on and apply in short order. The third area of processes that we talk about is really the cross-asset capital planning and management. It's how do we apply our revenue constraints and make prioritization decisions across these asset classes to better accomplish our overall objectives. And in the manual, we provide some information and guidance on that. We look at within that the process through which you can have consistent information across asset classes and use that to communicate and tell the story to partners, stakeholders, policymakers. We also use it as examples for how to model or communicate performance under different scenarios. So those are essentially the 6 processes, and as the manual is published and released, you'll see there's a lot of detail and good examples on how to move forward and apply that. I am not going to go into a lot of detail here, but another theme throughout the manual is a lot of emphasis that we've placed on communicating the impact, the business benefits from asset management, both to make the case and also to better manage ourselves and hold ourselves accountable for actually implementing this. And at the end of the day, it really is about outcomes. There are very good examples that we've unearthed of where it results in improved customer service. Similarly with productivity and reduced costs, better optimizing resource allocation, and certainly a theme that we see across the country where you start to have information consistently across your asset classes to really explain and tell the story and provide accountability. It really supports that type of improved communications. Now, turning to implementation, we put a lot of emphasis in this on implementation, and a theme within that is that we really need to understand, each of you does, and as an industry we do as we move forward with this, where are we today, and where do we want to be, and how do we move forward. Now, this exhibit illustrates different levels of asset management maturity as you look at that from, level 1, which really, I know where I want to be, and level 2, I know what I have, and maybe we have an inventory and we have some condition information, all the way sort of up the hierarchy so that we've got the type of information from which we can truly be data-driven, we can optimize our resource constraints both within an asset class and across the asset classes. And we're also and we're very much in a different mode of thinking, so that we're truly predicting and preventing failure, or we're even beyond that very consciously when we're doing our procurement, thinking about whether we're having a reliability-based approach, or we want to maybe take on more risk, in different ways of looking at it. We're doing it very consciously. When we've had dialogue with the industry around this, people find this quite useful, and we've asked. We have had 2 meetings with one of the APTA Standards Committee as a sort of sounding board for some of these concepts, and asked folks, well, where do they think the industry is? And the industry's turned around and said to us, somewhere between 0 and 2. I think that tells me that there's a recognition that we've a long way to go, but there's a lot of interest in getting there. I think we would also say, from what we've seen, there are elements that we see around the country where agencies have got some aspects of, say, a level 4 or level 5, that some of the building blocks aren't there. So you see different aspects of it. What we'd like to do now is maybe just get into a little bit of detail on one of the asset class examples.
This is a breakdown of an asset class hierarchy that we have been developing. It's still a work in process. In fact, it gets changed pretty regularly as we talk to more and more people, but this is really intended to just be a starting point for agencies if they don't already have an inventory, or they're thinking about redoing or rethinking their asset inventory. The idea with this inventory, or with this hierarchy, is that agencies should develop this in a way that best supports the business processes that you have. One transit agency's inventory may look entirely different from someone else's, and that's completely okay. It's really just about organizing your assets in a way that best supports the kinds of decision-making that you're going to be doing. And the decision-making can range anywhere from being a maintenance person and having to make day-to-day decisions about different components that you're going to be fixing. And it could range all the way up to a capital programming person that needs to make prioritization decisions across all of the asset classes. But the bottom line is, you want to have your assets organized in a way that best supports all of the business processes. And that requires having not just a good structure and organization, but also really good data management and processes for keeping the data up to date, but also having standards around what data you're tracking and how you track it. What we've done is we have a chapter of the manual that is devoted to each one of these asset classes. So each of the areas shown in black in this graphic has a section that describes considerations when it comes to life cycle management of that asset class. And when we say life cycle management of that class, we are suggesting that the agency should have a life cycle management plan for each of these asset classes, with a focus on the most critical assets. So in each of these life cycle management plans, you would track what are the performance metrics that I want to measure that asset class around. How do I monitor condition? What's my approach to gathering the condition data? What does it mean when I have different measurements of condition? What are general life cycle management approaches? And with the idea that all of this information is used on a daily basis for maximizing the performance of the asset across its whole life cycle, but also minimizing its life cycle costs and the risk around them. Just to give an example, we wanted to share one of these asset classes, just some highlights from it, just to give an idea of the kinds of information we'll be conveying in this chapter. So for maintenance facilities, and I purposely picked this because this is an area that transit agencies and truly all throughout all industries, facilities are often neglected. So this is a really important asset class to consider when doing life cycle management or asset management. For each one of these asset classes, we include a definition, and then we have really pages and pages of life cycle management considerations. For maintenance facilities, when looking at the design of maintenance facilities, you would want to consider on-site circulation of work processes so that you're actually considering the workflow when you're designing it. And when you're doing preventative maintenance of your maintenance facilities, ideally you'll be using a maintenance management system. And this is very traditionally done for managing the maintenance of vehicles, but I'd say less traditionally done for facilities. When it comes to capital rehabilitation, just one of the many suggestions is to replace all lighting and plumbing fixtures at once. It's a more cost-effective approach because if one's breaking, it's likely that others are soon going to fail sometime soon after. And when it comes to disposal of the facilities, amongst other considerations, one is to consider the resale of the equipment, and that's a great way to maximize your costs by minimizing the costs, really, at the end of the life cycle. When it comes to condition assessment and performance monitoring, there are a lot of things that can be done to monitor the condition of maintenance facilities, but I put in these two examples because facilities have people that are in them every day and they don't necessarily see the degradation of the condition of the facility. So these are just a couple of examples of condition monitoring that can be done to identify issues that maybe people that are in there on a daily basis wouldn't recognize. So to continue some of this specific life cycle management information for an asset class, we're also including sustainability considerations, and this just lists a couple of examples, but we have this for all of the asset classes. And then performance metrics. How do we make sure that we're actually providing the appropriate level of service for that asset class? So for a maintenance facility, you want to look at energy efficiency, but you also want to consider, is it available? Is it having the appropriate safety processes and procedures in place, and are employees happy and satisfied working in that environment? This just provides some sampling. Another really important part of asset management is managing all of the data that's used to support all of the decision making, because the idea with asset management is that you're making fact-based decisions across the asset life cycle, and that relies on good data. Right now, what we've seen in the transit industry is that transit agencies don't necessarily invest the money in systems, and when they do, they're not necessarily well integrated. What this graphic is intending to show is the kinds of functionality that are important in an enterprise asset management system. And in the center, you'll see these are the very kind of fundamental requirements for an asset management system, and that includes having an asset inventory. That's kind of at the crux of your asset management, enterprise asset management system. You would be tracking the asset condition, and then potentially for specific asset classes, you would be monitoring that condition on a regular basis. And that could be, you're monitoring the track by having cameras on your vehicles. It could be your SCADA system that's monitoring various systems. These potentially would all feed into the enterprise asset management system. Similarly, we have facilities management, fleet management, and maintenance management. Often these are all in one system. They could be, integrated or not integrated. Ideally, they're integrated. And then ideally, you're able to compile all this information and do scenario analysis where you're able to consider, well, if we invest in one asset versus another asset, what are the impacts overall to performance? Finally listed in this centerpiece is parts management, and that's all about better managing your inventory and having appropriate stock levels and seeing your usage trends to inform what stock is ordered and kept in-house. So these are all of the kind of core functionality, but ideally these are integrated with your engineering systems, which are listed on the bottom, and your enterprise systems listed at the top. And so it's truly about having integrated information, but with very reliable data because it's all tracked against single sources. So if you have one certain rail car with specific components, that rail car is tracked, it might be tracked in multiple systems here, but it really has one unique identifier, and you're able to use it for decision making from everything from a maintenance decision to a capital programming decision. So some key points I wanted to highlight is that we bring up the idea of tools towards the end of this because it is fundamental to asset management, but it's intended to support the overall asset management strategy and the processes. Transit agencies do have, obviously, many systems in place, so it's important to leverage and build upon what you have. And the one other thing I would mention is that it's really important to involve all of the users early on, because what we find is that many systems are developed with the intent of meeting the needs of one department, and they don't necessarily utilize all of the functionality that's available because they're not created or developed with input from throughout the agency. Lastly, I wanted to just share some peer practices, and I'll start with a couple of the U.S. transit agencies. You know, as we said, there are a lot of really great things going on at the transit agencies. Both Chicago CTA and MARTA in Atlanta have received FTA State of Good Repair grants, and both of them have taken the approach of putting a lot of time and energy and thought into developing an inventory and then using that inventory to develop an enterprise asset management system. Some highlights from each of these agencies. CTA has for many, many years tracked performance measures, you know, both at the asset class level and also at the enterprise level. So they track things like on-time performance, mean time between failure, vehicle cleanliness. I mean, this is all really important because it can be tracking that kind of information can drive the decision making. And CTA also was one of the first agencies to have a condition measurement, a consistent condition measurement across all of their asset classes. So they use that 1 to 5 metric. Moving down to MARTA, they also have a pretty significant asset management initiative going on. They define state of good repair as the condition of an asset where, at minimum, it's capable of delivering the required performance safely and reliably for a predetermined period of time. And so they actually have formal asset management plans for what they identify as their 16 major asset classes. And in each of those plans, they define what state of good repair means and how they're going to track the condition and what policies they're following when it comes to investment in each of those assets. Moving down to our international examples, both of these are in some ways very different from the U.S. examples because they outsourced their operations, and London Underground is actually shifting away from that model, but at the time when we collected the information from them, they were outsourcing it. Both of them require their contractors to maintain an inventory of their assets. They have performance-based contracts that requires each of the agencies to track what level of service they're meeting and what the investment requirements are across all of the assets to be able to meet the level of service. And both of them have performance incentives, so their contractors get paid more when they better meet the level of service objectives.
Thank you, David and Lauren, for a great presentation. The first question, how do we get a copy of the manual you're referring to?
Our game plan is to have a draft final by the time of the SGR roundtable, and we're currently in a review cycle for 60% of it, and we are kind of cranking away to get the remainder of it done on that timeline. So I know there's a lot of interest in it, but it'll be 5 or 6 weeks yet, I think, before we can start to circulate that.
Has FTA already established these specific criteria as requirements for funding, that is, language and policy, planning, grant applications, etc.?
I'll take a stab at answering that. So this manual is not going to be in any way a requirement. It's not going through any kind of congressional approvals or anything like that. But that being said, the FTA has talked about requiring asset management plans, and that's something that they continue to talk about. I believe that I believe Kyle said this last time, that the intent is to have another round of state of good repair grants. So when it comes to criteria, and I will not say this is an official thing, but being able to follow what's in this manual and some of the principles and the processes and all of that, I would think can only help an agency when it comes to implementing an asset management initiative.
And as some context, our intent here is to provide a resource that's not prescriptive, but that's really and that you can use to jumpstart the work that you would do to improve your asset management practices. That's the intent here. Also, but I guess the other intent is to provide a standard or a bar that we can say, these are the industry standards of good practice, generally accepted industry standards of good practice, and what you would expect to see in a mature asset management organization. That's the intent that we've set for this. Exactly what's done with it and whatnot through sort of any FTA rulemaking, I think FTA really needs to speak to that. But having been involved with them in the start from this, the intent with this is to provide it as truly as a resource to improve the awareness and practice of asset management.
Are the changes to the asset classes, for example, combining facilities with stations and adding building systems and components, a recommendation from the study, or is FTA already implementing this change?
This is really a work in progress, as we said, and interestingly, we're probably going to be combining facilities and stations with building systems and components. We're finding that there's, if anything, one is a subset of the other. But this is intended to be a starting point that has the potential to apply to transit agencies across the country. But the FTA is not going to be putting this out as a requirement, as far as we know.
Does anyone have standard operating procedures for implementing an asset management program?
I would say that there is no standard operating procedure that exists, but when it comes to implementing something for U.S. transit agencies, this is probably the best resource guide. And as we said, that there are other guidance documents available that support international asset management projects, but this one is kind of what we believe is that it takes kind of the best of from all of those, but applies it to the U.S. transit industry.
And the other, when you look at these other documents, they're good, but they're process documents. It's like when you look at, for anything an ISO standard, it's a process, and you can audit or look at how you are as an agency. Do we have those processes in place? One of the themes that we've got here is that we want to take this, really embed it in getting things implemented and getting to better outcomes, is looking at what's a better outcome. Yeah, you'd have the process in place because we understand that the processes reflect best practice, but in applying the processes, we're getting to better outcomes, and that's sort of a theme that we've got. So I don't think the other documents and process manuals are more silent on implementing change, but I think, as probably many of you know, there's a whole body of literature on how to implement change and improvements to various programs, and that body of knowledge applies equally to asset management. And what we have emphasized in the manual really is using an assessment of where you are, looking at readiness for change and how you'd address change management in a very practical way, then to look at that and then look at what's been done elsewhere to identify things that you can implement in fairly short order that would have a good impact on your business. So I don't know. I'd like to think that when we're done with this, you'll have a very good primer on how to get to grips with implementation.
How is the FTA Asset Management Manual related to PAS 55, and does it differ or improve upon asset management-related education provided by IAM?
As both of us have said, we've tried to take the best of from both these documents and others. IAM is intended to be a best practice document, and then PAS 55 is intended to be a standard, but both of them were written for and to support broader industries. They are not necessarily focused on transit, and we believe there are some very unique things about the U.S. transit industry that those guidance documents do not necessarily address. I will say that it's right to say that IAM is more of an education-based one, and Pass 55, they have you know, an actual assessment, and you can become certified in Pass 55, and it's a little bit more formal. But you know, the concepts across really all of them, including our manual, are very similar. I mean, everybody needs to have an inventory. Everybody needs to you know, have data-driven management and that kind of thing. But ours is probably the most, well, it is the most targeted towards the U.S. transit industry.
Yeah. So I guess it's not for us to say it's better. It's different, and the intent is to be very specific. There's a portion of our work that would lend itself very well to training and really facilitation of dialogue within agencies by providing examples, very specific examples from within the transit agency. On the highway side, there were two goes around with what was a transportation asset management manual. A lot of very, very good material in it. The biggest challenge that the folks found from that was that the examples were all international, and there wasn't enough sort of specific examples. So we've tried to learn from that.
Will your recommendation include details related to engineering best practices in the transit environment? For example, engineering modifications, management of drawings, configuration control, configuration management, testing, etc.
We're scratching the surface, but maybe we're getting a little bit deeper than scratching the surface. I mean, as Laura was talking about the asset class information, what we want to do there is identify generally accepted, you know, standards of good practice for each of the assets and where there are industry standards for it. But in many of these areas, you know, there are not industry standards of best practice for engineering across the life cycle. Where there are, we've tried to identify it, but I think in any one of these asset class areas you could get into a tremendous amount of detail. So what we've wanted to do was provide a reader an orientation to where that exists.
Wanted to ask a question about the draft asset management manual, if it touched on the relationship between state DOTs as administrator of transit grants and their subrecipients that are actually the owners of the asset. And in our case, it's mostly rolling stock buses, but occasionally a few facilities. We as a grant administration agency, we have a responsibility to have an inventory of all the grant-funded assets, but it seems like there's responsibilities that the owner of the asset has, and there's responsibilities that a state DOT granting agency has. And is there much discussion about the space that each of those role players operates?
What we've done within the manual is focused on the owner and operator of the asset, which and get asset management from that perspective, and even down to the, you know, when people ask, well, what level of detail do you go down to, is tying the management responsibility to the level at which to the maintainable unit, and then kind of rolling that up. So we've not addressed, you know, a state DOT role in that capability, and you know, it has occurred to me in looking at this that, you know, and I don't know the extent to which they're still done, but the old public transportation management systems, which had some inventory information and those sorts of things, I think it's a good question, but we've not really addressed that. The focus has been primarily on it has been exclusively, on the owner and operator of the asset.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add is that potentially, because we're suggesting in this manual that agencies maintain a life cycle management plan for each of the asset classes, and within that life cycle management plan, the agency would lay out who, in quotes, owns the asset across its life cycle, but then any other players or any of the players that are involved throughout its life cycle. So that could be anywhere from procurement to maintaining it to owning it, and what those roles are. So that could be the place that we included. I don't think we explicitly say it like David's saying.
Regular, systematic, and objective assessments of all assets is difficult to get started. Have best practices for assessments been documented for each asset type?
Okay, so I agree. It's a huge undertaking, and some agencies, in fact, many agencies, are approaching this by first doing one huge condition assessment across the whole agency, and then using that as a baseline to go forward and develop plans for maintaining that data and having regular condition assessments. What we're suggesting in the manual is that an agency develop a life cycle management plan for each of the asset classes, and in that plan outline the approach to doing condition assessments. And for a more critical asset, say for example a rail car, that's going to include everything from daily condition assessments that touch on just your most basic or routine assessments, and then you might have ones that are done every X amount of miles or X amount of time, whatever your maintenance approach is. But the idea is to build those practices into your existing maintenance practices, ideally, so you're capturing that information and really focusing on your most critical assets. So the manual is going to lay out those kind of big picture thoughts, and then in the chapter where we highlight information on each of the asset classes, we'll talk about considerations when it comes to each of the asset classes.